What if the safest, richest, cleanest country on earth got that way by breaking almost every rule the rest of the world is afraid to touch? Singapore is a tiny island with almost no natural resources, yet it somehow became one of the wealthiest nations on the planet. It did this by making choices that most governments would never dare to make. Choices that sound strict, sometimes even shocking, but that quietly turned chaos into order and poverty into prosperity. Today we are going to walk through 10 of these bold moves. Some of them will surprise you. Some of them might even make you uncomfortable. But by the end of this video, you will understand why so many leaders around the world study Singapore, admire Singapore, and still refuse to copy Singapore. Because copying Singapore means being brave enough to make decisions that trade a little bit of freedom for a lot of stability. So let us dive into the story of the tiny nation that dared to be different. Point 1. The death penalty for drug trafficking. Let us start with the one that shocks people the most. Singapore enforces the death penalty for drug trafficking, even for relatively small amounts. While many countries are moving toward decriminalizing drugs, Singapore moved in the exact opposite direction. The government believes that drugs destroy families, destroy communities, and destroy futures, so they decided the punishment must match the damage. This is not a policy hidden in the shadows. Warning signs are posted right at the airport the moment you land, written in plain language, so there is zero confusion about the consequences. The result is one of the lowest drug usage rates among developed nations, something almost unheard of in a bustling global city. Critics call it harsh and even cruel. Supporters call it the reason Singapore never became a hub for organized crime like so many other trade and travel centers around the world. Whichever side you land on, one thing is certain. No other wealthy nation has been willing to take this stance and hold it for decades without backing down. Point 2. Caning as a legal punishment. Now that we have talked about drugs, let us talk about how Singapore handles other crimes too, because the theme of strict but effective punishment does not stop there. Singapore still uses caning as an official legal punishment for certain crimes, including vandalism, rioting, and some violent offenses. Picture this. In the year 1994, an American teenager named Michael Fay was caned in Singapore for spray painting cars, and it became international news. Countries around the world, including the United States, pleaded for leniency. Singapore listened politely and reduced the number of strokes slightly, but did not remove the punishment entirely. That single moment showed the world exactly how serious Singapore is about order. The logic behind this is simple and almost uncomfortable in its honesty. Physical punishment leaves a memory that a fine or a warning simply cannot match. Whether you find this fair or frightening, it is impossible to ignore the results. Vandalism rates in Singapore remain incredibly low, and public spaces stay remarkably clean and respected, something many larger cities can only dream about. Point 3. Force savings through the CPF system. Moving from punishment to protection, Singapore made another decision most countries are too afraid to make. It forces its citizens to save money. The Central Provident Fund, known simply as CPF, takes a portion of every worker's salary and locks it away for retirement, healthcare, and housing. Employers also contribute on top of that, which means every single working citizen is quietly building a financial safety net without even having to think about it. Imagine a nation where almost nobody has to worry about having zero savings by the time they retire, because the system never gave them the choice to skip saving in the first place. Most governments avoid this idea because taking money directly from paychecks feels controlling and unpopular. Singapore did it anyway, and now enjoys incredibly high savings rates and low levels of elderly poverty compared to many wealthy nations. It is a policy built on a simple but bold belief. Sometimes people need to be protected from their own short-term decisions, even if it means giving up a little bit of financial freedom today for real security tomorrow. Point 4. Turning renters into owners. Speaking of long-term security, let us talk about housing, because this next move might be the most impressive of them all. In the 1960s, Singapore was full of overcrowded slums and desperate housing shortages. Instead of leaving this problem to private developers, the government built massive amounts of public housing and then did something unusual. It sold these homes to citizens at affordable prices instead of just renting them out. Today, more than 80% of Singaporeans own their own home, one of the highest home ownership rates anywhere on the planet. Think about how different that is from many major cities today, where owning a home feels like an impossible dream for entire generations of young workers. Singapore made home ownership a national mission rather than a personal struggle. This single decision created stability, pride, and a sense of belonging that keeps communities strong. Most countries hesitate to get this involved in housing, fearing it looks too much like government control. Singapore leaned into that control and built one of the most stable housing markets in the world because of it. Point 5. Banning chewing gum completely. After talking about something as serious as housing, let us lighten the mood slightly, although this next rule is still deeply serious to Singapore. Since 1992, chewing gum has been banned from sale across the entire country. Yes, you heard that correctly. You cannot simply walk into a store and buy a pack of gum. This rule exists because sticky gum was constantly jammed into train doors, stuck under seats, and pressed into sidewalks, costing enormous amounts of money in cleanup and repair. Instead of running endless awareness campaigns hoping people would behave better, Singapore simply removed the temptation altogether. It sounds almost funny until you realize how effective it actually is. Public transportation runs smoothly, streets stay spotless, and cleaning costs remain remarkably low. Other countries look at overflowing trash and gum stuck to nearly every surface and shrug, treating it as a normal part of city life. Singapore looked at the same problem and said no, we would rather remove the source entirely, even if it means saying goodbye to something as small and harmless as bubble gum. Point 6. Paying politicians like top executives. Now let us shift from small habits to something much bigger, the way Singapore treats its own leaders. Government ministers in Singapore are paid extremely high salaries, some earning well over $1 million a year. In most countries, this would spark outrage and endless protests. But Singapore's reasoning is surprisingly logical. If you pay leaders poorly, you either attract people who are not truly talented, or you create leaders who become tempted by corruption to make up the difference. So instead, Singapore pays its top leaders salaries similar to private sector executives, aiming to attract genuinely skilled people while removing the excuse for bribery. The results speak loudly. Singapore consistently ranks among the least corrupt nations on Earth, sitting comfortably alongside countries like Denmark and New Zealand. Meanwhile, many nations with underpaid officials continue struggling with corruption scandals year after year. It is a bold trade-off. Pay leaders more upfront, expect much more in return, and remove the temptation entirely. Most governments are simply too scared of public backlash to even attempt this kind of transparency. Point 6. Paying politicians like top executives. Now let us shift from small habits to something much bigger, the way Singapore treats its own leaders. Government ministers in Singapore are paid extremely high salaries, some earning well over $1 million a year. In most countries, this would spark outrage and endless protests. But Singapore's reasoning is surprisingly logical. If you pay leaders poorly, you either attract people who are not truly talented, or you create leaders who become tempted by corruption to make up the difference. So instead, Singapore pays its top leaders salaries similar to private sector executives, aiming to attract genuinely skilled people while removing the excuse for bribery. The results speak loudly. Singapore consistently ranks among the least corrupt nations on Earth, sitting comfortably alongside countries like Denmark and New Zealand. Meanwhile, many nations with underpaid officials continue struggling with corruption scandals year after year. It is a bold trade-off. Pay leaders more upfront, expect much more in return, and remove the temptation entirely. Most governments are simply too scared of public backlash to even attempt this kind of transparency. Point 8. Mandatory military service for young men. Let us shift now to something deeply personal for every young man growing up in Singapore. National service is mandatory, requiring nearly 2 years of military or civil defense training once a young man turns 18. There are very few exceptions, regardless of family wealth or social status. Imagine finishing high school, feeling ready to start university or your career, and instead spending 2 full years in intense physical and disciplinary training. Many countries have slowly phased out mandatory service, worried about public resistance, and lost economic productivity. Singapore held firm, believing that shared sacrifice creates shared unity, especially in such a small and vulnerable nation surrounded by much larger neighbors. This shared experience creates strong bonds across different ethnic and economic backgrounds, something incredibly valuable in such a diverse society. It also keeps the country prepared and disciplined at a national level. While uncomfortable for many young men experiencing it firsthand, this policy has quietly strengthened both national security and national identity for more than 5 decades. Point 9. Forcing different races to live together. Building on that same idea of unity, Singapore made another incredibly bold decision regarding where people are allowed to live. Through something called the Ethnic Integration Policy, public housing neighborhoods have strict quotas limiting how many families from each ethnic group can live in a single building or block. This might sound uncomfortable at first, almost like the government interfering in deeply personal choices. But the goal behind it is powerful. Singapore is home to Chinese, Malay, Indian, and many other communities, and the government wanted to prevent the kind of ethnic segregation that has caused tension and division in other multicultural nations. By intentionally mixing communities within neighborhoods, children grow up playing alongside classmates from completely different backgrounds, and adults build genuine friendships across cultural lines. Most countries would never dare regulate where people choose to live based on ethnicity, fearing it feels invasive or controlling. Singapore embraced the discomfort because the long-term reward, a genuinely integrated and peaceful society, was worth more than short-term convenience. Point 10. Making Singapore the ultimate fine city. Finally, let us end with the policy most visitors notice within their very first hour in the country. Singapore is famously nicknamed the Fine City, and that nickname works as a clever double meaning. Yes, it is a beautiful and impressive city, but it is also filled with fines for nearly everything. Littering, jaywalking, eating on public trains, even failing to flush a public toilet can result in real financial penalties. Tourists often laugh nervously reading the long list of rules posted at the airport, unsure if it is a joke. It is not. These fines are actively enforced, and the results are impossible to argue with. Singapore consistently ranks among the cleanest cities on Earth, with sidewalks, parks, and train stations that look freshly cleaned at every hour of the day. Other major cities struggle for decades with litter and public disorder, often too afraid of appearing overly controlling to enforce similar rules. Singapore decided that mild inconvenience for citizens was a small price to pay for a city that feels genuinely safe, clean, and remarkably pleasant to live in every single day. So there you have it, 10 incredibly bold decisions that turned a small, resource-poor island into one of the most admired nations on Earth. Some of these choices probably made you uncomfortable. Some of them probably impressed you deeply. And that mix of emotions is exactly what makes Singapore such a fascinating story to tell. It proves that sometimes the boldest path forward is not the most popular one, and that real progress often requires decisions other countries are simply too afraid to make. Singapore did not become successful by accident. It became successful by choosing discipline over comfort, unity over division, and long-term vision over short-term popularity, again and again and again. If this video opened your eyes to a side of Singapore you never knew existed, please hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel grow. I would love to hear which one of these 10 points shocked you the most, so drop your thoughts down in the comments below. And if you enjoy deep dives like this one, make sure you subscribe, because there are so many more incredible stories like this one still waiting to be told. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the very next video.